My daughter-in-law stood up at the will reading and announced she was cutting me out of my husband's $52 million estate. I just sat there, frozen, no tears left to cry. I was the one who took care of him when he couldn't walk, and now she acted like I had never existed. Then the lawyer laughed, and in that moment, something shifted. What had Patrick hidden before he died? Why did it feel like he was speaking from beyond the grave? After the funeral, I stood alone in the garden, watching the last cars drive away. They left behind half-full cups and folding chairs, the scent of lilies still hanging in the air. No one came back to see if I needed a ride, not even Rebecca. She had arranged everything, down to the coffee cups and the slideshow, timed to the second. It was flawless in a cold, sterile way Patrick would have hated. He always said funerals should be messy. People should cry, forget their umbrellas, tell bad jokes. They should feel real. But this didn't. It felt like a performance, like the final act of a play I hadn't been invited to. When I stepped inside, Rebecca was already collecting papers at the dining table. I cleared my throat, but she didn't look up, just kept stacking folders. Then, without turning, she said, "We'll be moving forward with the legal processing next week. I've arranged everything." No mention of me, no question of what I wanted, no acknowledgement of the 6 months I spent sleeping on a hospital chair while she was flying off for conferences. I tried to tell myself it was just grief, that maybe she didn't know how to speak to me, but then she handed me a small box with Patrick's name on it. She said, "He asked me to give you this." Inside was a single tie clip. Just that. No note, no letter. Patrick and I used to write to each other even while living under the same roof, and now all I got was a tie clip he barely wore. Rebecca smiled politely and walked away as if that was the end of it. That night, I sat in the kitchen with a lukewarm cup of tea, realizing that for the first time since Patrick died, I felt like a stranger in the home we built together. The walls still smelled like his aftershave, his books lined the hallway, but it was as if my name had been quietly erased from every room. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew something had shifted. There was a coldness in the air that wasn't just grief. It felt like everyone had received a new script for my life, and I was the only one left in the dark. Then came the email. Sent by Rebecca, assistant, not even her. Subject line, estate administration meeting scheduled. No message, no hope you're holding up, just a date and time, like a dental appointment. The meeting was set for Wednesday 9 a.m. at her firm's downtown office. That morning, I arrived 5 minutes late, unsure if I should even go. The receptionist looked at me like I didn't belong there, but I smoothed down my coat and followed her into the conference room. 7 people in dark suits sat around the table. Rebecca at the head, hair pulled back, eyes on her folders. She didn't greet me, just gave a small nod toward a seat at the far end of the table, away from the coffee, away from the folders. No one offered me a packet or a pen. I sat, hands folded in my lap. Rebecca cleared her throat. "As executor of the estate," she began, her voice cold and precise, "I will walk us through the distribution of assets as laid out in the finalized will." She listed stocks, trust accounts, properties, a partial winery investment. Then she announced that Patrick had transferred primary control of the family trust to her 6 months before. I blinked. That couldn't be true. Patrick and I had managed that trust together for 20 years, and he never mentioned transferring it to her. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. At the end, an associate asked, "And Mrs. Sloane's share?" Rebecca didn't look up. "There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing." Just like that, I was erased. No explanation, no apology, just silence. When the meeting ended, I waited for everyone to leave. Rebecca pats her briefcase slowly, as if expecting me to speak. But I didn't. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and left without looking back. Outside, the cold air hit my face. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad, just hollow, as if my life had been folded into a document and filed under someone else's name. Rebecca hadn't just claimed control that day, she claimed the narrative. She spoke over my silence, and no one questioned it. As I walked to the parking garage, one sentence echoed in my mind. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her. I wasn't a wife anymore. I wasn't even a widow. I was nothing. That afternoon, I sat in the dark, unable to turn on the lights. The silence was louder than any conversation I could bear. Patrick's cane still rested by the door from our last chemo visit. I hadn't moved it. I couldn't. Later that evening, I opened the drawer in Patrick's study without thinking. It squeaked the way it always did. He used to say it needed oil. I always said I liked the sound because it meant he was home. Inside were receipts, notes, his favorite pencil, and then, at the very back, a small manila folder I didn't recognize. No label, no date. Inside were 3 pages. The first was a handwritten note in Patrick's shaky handwriting. Rebecca wants me to update the will. Says it needs to reflect current holdings. I asked why, and she said it's for clarity. She started drawing up papers on my behalf. I haven't signed anything yet. I haven't told Marietta. She'd ask the questions I'm afraid of. The second page was a photocopy of a will I had never seen, covered in Patrick's handwritten notes and edits. My name was there, then crossed out, with the note in the margin, discuss with Rebecca. The third was a typed schedule of legal meetings, dates from the time Patrick was in treatment, when the only time he was alone was when Rebecca came to take over. That thin folder felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I placed the pages gently on the desk and leaned back, the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, remembering the last time Patrick spoke about the will over dinner. You don't have to worry about anything, Ma. I've made sure of that. He reached across the table, squeezing my wrist, his thumb pressing gently into my skin. Now, all I could feel was the cold imprint of his absence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the study, rereading those pages as dawn crept in, piece by piece. By morning, I knew this wasn't just a clerical error. This was the beginning of a truth I could no longer ignore. It wasn't a clerical oversight. This was deliberate. Rebecca had orchestrated something and Patrick had sensed it, maybe even tried to stop it, but it was too late. I placed the pages back in the folder and hid it under a stack of old National Geographic magazines in the hallway closet. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let this go. The next morning, I called Daniel Cow. We hadn't spoken since Patrick's retirement party, but Patrick trusted him, and so did I. Daniel picked up on the second ring. When I said my name, he paused, then quietly agreed to meet the next day. After the call, I stood by the window looking out at the yard. The wind tugged at the last of the maple leaves, the same trees Patrick planted 30 years ago. He once told me they'd outlive us both. Maybe they would, but I wouldn't let silence be the last thing Patrick left behind, not while I was still breathing. Daniel met me at a small cafe off Elm Street, a place that hadn't changed in decades. Chipped mugs, soft jazz, rain tapping softly on the windows. He slid into the booth across from me, his coat still damp, and nodded. I didn't waste time. I pushed the manila folder across the table. He read in silence, flipping through each page, his brow tightening when he reached Patrick's handwritten note. Watching him read made everything real, like I hadn't imagined the red ink, the crossed out lines that once held my name. When he finished, he closed the folder softly. His voice was calm but firm. It's more than suspicious. It's intentional. He pulled out a notepad and began jotting down dates, law firm names, and circled something I hadn't noticed before. The witness signatures on the updated will were strangers. Patrick always used people he trusted, neighbors, friends, but these were outsiders Rebecca had brought in without telling me. We agreed to move quietly, no confrontation, not yet. Daniel would request certified copies of the will and cross-check them with the notes I had found. In the meantime, I would leave everything as it was. Back home, I tucked the folder into a lockbox we used for passports and medical papers. Then I sat at Patrick's old desk and opened his leather-bound calendar. Most of his things were already gone. Rebecca had packed his books, donated his clothes, sent off his golf clubs, but the calendar remained. That's where I found the name, Hal Givens, circled twice, penciled on a Tuesday morning. I remembered Hal vaguely, a tax consultant Patrick met through a nonprofit. The thought that Patrick met with him while he was ill and never told me stung more than I wanted to admit. I called Daniel and told him. He said he'd look into it, maybe reach out quietly. The next few days felt slow. I kept up appearances, grocery shopping, watering the plants, sitting quietly at book club, while underneath, I was alert, waiting. Then, on Friday, Daniel called. He had spoken with Hal. What he told me made my stomach drop. Hal remembered Patrick coming in, frail, exhausted, barely able to hold a pen. They had talked for nearly an hour about the trust. Patrick had questions about protecting me, about long-term safeguards. But Hal said Patrick seemed hesitant, repeating that Rebecca would take care of it. Hal had offered to set up an independent review to ensure everything was clear, but Patrick never followed up. A week later, Rebecca called Hal, canceling the appointment, saying Patrick didn't need his services. Daniel let the silence on the phone stretch before he added, Hal kept notes. They aren't legally binding, but they show Patrick had doubts. They could be enough to open a formal inquiry if we chose to take that path. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone cold in my hand. That night, I pulled out an old photo album, not for nostalgia, but for clarity. In every family photo, every holiday, every dinner with friends, Rebecca was there, smiling, helping, hovering, always in the background, always in control. I had once believed she was loyal, that she cared about family, about us. But now I saw it. The quiet positioning, the control, the carefully curated trust. The betrayal hurt, but what hurt more was realizing Patrick had sensed something was wrong. Endeavor told me. I placed the album back on the shelf and turned off the light. There was no anger yet, only a quiet resolve. Whatever Rebecca had rewritten, I would find a way to write back. After the call of Daniel, sleep didn't come. I had always believed in patience, in giving people space to reveal who they truly are. But every day that passed felt like letting Rebecca rewrite Patrick's legacy in her favor. The following Monday, Daniel called again. His voice was steady, but faster this time. He had reviewed the county records and found something odd. The final copy of Patrick's will, the one Rebecca had filed, had a different case number than the original draft. The original will, the one Patrick and I had reviewed together, had disappeared from the archive, marked as superseded, with no documentation showing who initiated the change. Daniel said it was time to bring in someone else, Lydia Velasquez, a probate litigation specialist. We met at Daniel's office on Wednesday morning. Lydia was sharp, precise, dressed simply, no wasted words. She listened as Daniel laid out everything, taking notes, asking direct questions. When she heard about the unknown witnesses, she raised an eyebrow. Their names have come up before. Unlicensed notaries paid to sign documents without proper presence. She wrote quickly, then looked up. This wasn't just sloppy. It looks constructed. I didn't speak. I just stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what we would find. Because now, it wasn't just about what Rebecca had done. It was about what Patrick had tried to protect. And what I was willing to do to protect it too. Patrick used to say he liked offices with a view. Said he reminded him how small we really were. That no matter how carefully we planned, life kept moving. Above us, below us, around us. Before I left Lydia's office, she told me she would quietly file an inquiry with the probate court. If Rebecca had filed anything improperly, there would be a trace, an email, a timestamp, a paper trail hidden beneath routine. Back home, I stepped into the garage for the first time in weeks. Patrick's old file cabinet still smelled faintly of tobacco and pine. I pulled open the bottom drawer where he kept tax records, folders marked by year, nearly 2 decades lined up like a quiet history of our life. In last year's folder, I found a document titled Revocable Living Trust Addendum. It was unsigned, covered in revisions, as if Patrick had wrestled with the wording, trying to get it right. My name was there, clear, under a section labeled Survivor Protections. His handwriting crowded the margins with notes about healthcare, housing, legal support, things he wanted me to never worry about. Next to it, he had scribbled a line I recognized instantly. We talked about this. Rebecca said she'd handle it. It felt like seeing the moment he handed over the reins, whether out of exhaustion, misplaced trust, or the hope it would all sort itself out. I copied the document and called Daniel. He told me to bring it in the next morning. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the wind. My body ached, not from age, but from carrying secrets that weren't mine to carry. I thought about how easily my name had been removed from the life Patrick and I built, and how quickly someone else had stepped into the silence he left behind. For years, I believed love meant trust without question. But maybe love also meant protecting the truth when someone else couldn't, even if it hurt. Even if it tore open wounds that had barely begun to heal. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and dressed, carefully, not for vanity, but to feel like myself again. Like the woman Patrick married, not the ghost Rebecca was trying to edit out of the story. At Daniel's office, Lydia was already there. She read the document in silence, lips pressed tight, then looked up. This will help. A lot. She explained their next step, filing a motion to preserve the remaining estate assets. If the court approved, Rebecca would no longer be able to move funds or property until the investigation was resolved. This wasn't revenge. It was protection. I nodded. I didn't need revenge. I needed space to breathe and the chance to remember Patrick not as a man who left me behind, but as someone who tried and maybe failed to shield me in the end. If Rebecca had rewritten the terms of our life, then I would rewrite the ending quietly, intentionally, and it would begin now. 3 days later, Lydia called. The motion to freeze the estate had been approved. It was temporary, but it meant Rebecca could no longer move money or reassign property until the investigation was resolved. I didn't say much. I just exhaled and let the silence settle in. It felt like the first solid step forward. That afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single glossy invitation with embossed lettering. Rebecca was hosting a private tribute to Patrick at the country club. Cocktails, hors d'oeuvres, a charity auction in his name. The date was just 4 days away. No phone call, no message, just a card. Like I was a guest, not the woman who spent 43 years by his side. I didn't throw it away. I tucked it into the drawer next to the couch and sat with the thought. That evening, I called Daniel and told him I wanted to attend. He offered to come with me in case anything happened. I declined. This wasn't about confrontation, not yet. This was about presence, about standing in a room someone else tried to erase me from. On Saturday, I dressed carefully. Navy slacks, a silk blouse Patrick bought me for our 35th anniversary, a thin silver chain. Nothing loud, but intentional. The country club parking lot was already full when I arrived. I recognized half the names on the guest list: friends, colleagues, board members, people who had shared dinners at our house, toasted anniversaries, signed Christmas cards. Inside, the room was bright, polished floors, floral centerpieces, the scent of catered food. Near the bar stood a framed photo of Patrick, the one Rebecca insisted on using for the obituary, where he looked tired, his smile weak. I hated that photo. Rebecca was in the center of it all, composed, every movement practiced, greeting guests like a queen receiving subjects. When she saw me, her expression flickered before she forced a polite smile. I nodded, but did not return it. I moved to a quieter corner near the auction table labeled Patrick's Favorite Things. A signed baseball, a vintage pen, a first edition novel I had given him for his birthday. I touched the corner of the spine. My name was nowhere on the label. A man I didn't know introduced himself as one of Patrick's former business partners. He asked kindly how I was managing the estate and whether I had made changes to the fund allegations. I froze. He assumed I was still the trustee. When I told him I wasn't, that I had been removed before Patrick died, his expression shifted to polite confusion before he nodded and stepped away. It wasn't much, but it told me something. Rebecca hadn't told everyone the truth. Not about the will, not about the shift in control, not about the auction items she had taken from my home without asking. I stayed 20 more minutes, speaking to one of Patrick's old board colleagues. Almost in passing, he mentioned an email from Rebecca weeks before Patrick passed, outlining suggested donation amounts, legal phrasing, and managing partner responsibilities. I thanked him, smiled, and left. In the car, I sat with the engine off, hands on the wheel. That was the moment it all crystallized. Rebecca hadn't waited for Patrick to pass. She had started orchestrating the transition while he was still breathing. She had used his illness as cover, his trust as currency, and my silence as permission. But that silence was ending. The next morning, I met with Daniel and Lydia. I handed them my notes from that night. Every phrase, every inconsistency. Lydia leaned back. This is more than financial manipulation. This points to intentional premeditation and possibly coercion. Daniel agreed. They would begin drafting a motion to contest the will, not just for my share, but to protect the integrity of Patrick's last wishes. I left the office and walked home slowly, not because I was tired, but because I needed each step to remind me of who I still was. The wife, the witness, the one left standing after the applause had faded. And now, finally, the one ready to speak. The following Monday began with rain, thin and steady, washing over the city like a quiet promise. This was not the end. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching raindrops race down the window, tiny reminders that the world keeps moving, even when everything inside you feels paused. At exactly 9:15, Daniel called. Lydia filed the motion to challenge the will. Fraud. Undue influence. The court had accepted it, scheduling a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. It would be short, just enough to lay the groundwork, but it would open the door to discovery. We could begin requesting Rebecca's internal emails, financial records, digital documents. It felt like prying open a sealed vault. That afternoon, I met Lydia at her office. Her assistant ushered me into a small conference room. Papers and printed emails spread across the table, color-coded tabs and timelines taped to the wall, the air heavy with quiet purpose. When Lydia entered, she held a single printout. An email Rebecca had sent 6 weeks before Patrick passed. The subject line: revised structure, immediate actions. The message was short, clinical. Rebecca had instructed her team to expedite trust finalization and remove all clauses she considered discretionary. My name appeared only once. Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. That was it. My entire life with Patrick, 43 years, reduced to a single line in someone else's inbox. Lydia didn't look at me. She didn't need to. "Are you ready to proceed?" she asked. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. The days that followed blurred into paperwork and quiet determination. I kept my head down, avoided unnecessary conversation, and walked the neighborhood each evening past houses still displaying holiday wreaths. Nothing looked different on the outside, but I knew better now. The most dangerous betrayals rarely come with alarms. They slip in quietly, hidden in emails, in ink, in the erasure of a name. By Thursday, Lydia had enough to begin issuing subpoenas. She filed to obtain Patrick's digital communications from the last 6 months of his life and requested a deposition for one of Rebecca's legal assistants, a woman who had notarized the disputed documents. Daniel found inconsistencies in the signature timestamps. 2 signatures logged on a Sunday evening when the office was supposedly closed. I froze when I read that. Patrick hated working weekends, and he never signed anything without asking me to read it first. I gave Lydia permission to request a forensic handwriting expert to compare Patrick's medical file signatures with those on the revised documents. It might not be definitive, but it would be enough to raise questions. Loud, unavoidable questions. That night, I didn't sit in grief. I sat in clarity. For the first time in months, I felt the balance shifting. That weekend, I drove to the cemetery. The sky was low and gray, the air damp, the world quiet. Patrick's headstone was simple. His name, the dates, a single line beneath. He lived with grace, he left with love. I stood there for a long time. I didn't speak aloud, but I let the moment settle in. I knew now he had trusted the wrong person. He had left too much undone, but I didn't hold that against him anymore. For too many nights, I had wondered what he was thinking near the end, if he had tried to protect me and failed. But it no longer mattered, because now I would protect the truth myself. When I returned home, a message from Lydia was waiting. The assistant agreed to speak. She would be deposed on Tuesday. That was the moment everything cracked open. Rebecca had orchestrated the edits, silenced dissent, but she had overlooked the smallest variable. Someone had noticed. Someone was ready to speak. That night, I stood longer than usual in our bedroom doorway, looking at the photo on the dresser. Patrick and me in Maine, laughing in the wind, the frame tilted slightly to the left. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a stranger in my own story. I felt like a woman returning to her rightful place, not in anger, in truth. Tuesday morning was crisp, the city still wrapped in dawn fog, everything suspended and quiet as I arrived at Lydia's office. Inside, lights were already on. Daniel was sorting papers, Lydia on the phone near the window. On the conference table sat a small voice recorder and a cup of tea for the woman we were waiting for. Her name was Ava Kendall, mid-30s, sharp eyes, hands that moved restlessly, as if she hadn't yet found a place to set down her fear. She arrived exactly on time, wearing a gray cardigan and dark jeans. No makeup, no jewelry, just a quiet kind of resolve. Lydia laid out the parameters of the deposition. Ava nodded. She understood. She had reviewed the documents. She had kept her own copies. She wasn't there to accuse. She was there to tell the truth. She began with the timeline. Rebecca had brought her into the revisions 6 weeks before Patrick passed. Ava found it odd that normal procedures were bypassed. For someone like Patrick, revisions meant meetings, reviews, notarized acknowledgments. But this time, things moved too quickly. One evening, Ava had stayed late to retrieve her jacket. She saw Rebecca and another staffer in the conference room with a stack of unsigned forms. Rebecca asked Ava to witness a signature, claiming Patrick had just stepped out, urging her it was urgent, no big deal. Ava wrote it down in her planner. 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witness signature for R. No P present. Lydia asked clarifying questions. Ava answered calmly. She wasn't bitter, just clear. She noted the metadata didn't match the date of the signature. The will's formatting had been changed to remove sections that required my countersignature as co-trustee. Then Ava added something else. She had overheard Rebecca on a call saying, "Liquidate silently, no delays." It was 2 days before Patrick was hospitalized for the final time. Ava said she knew something was wrong, but Rebecca had power and Ava had a mortgage, a child, a job. But now, seeing how much had come into question, she couldn't stay silent. She signed her statement and dated it. Lydia thanked her. Daniel walked her out. When the door closed, Lydia sat down and placed both hands flat on the table. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't fear. It was the sound of the truth finally finding its way to the surface. And it was only the beginning. That was the break we needed. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. We had a timestamp, a first-hand witness, language that suggested manipulation, maybe even preemptive intent, enough to bring before a judge and demand a formal examination of the trust. Daniel leaned back, exhaling, the first relief I'd seen on his face. I didn't feel it, not yet, because I knew what would come next. Rebecca would find out. And when she did, she wouldn't panic. She would plan. 2 days later, it began. A letter arrived from her attorney, polished, cold. They accused me of interfering with a lawful estate transition, claimed I was driven by grief and personal bitterness, threatened to pursue legal costs if I didn't withdraw my motion within 10 business days. I read it 3 times, folded it neatly, and set it beside my coffee. Then I called Daniel. He asked if I was okay. I've been more than okay for years, I told him. I've just been quiet. Silence isn't surrender. He laughed softly. That's the best thing I've heard all week. That afternoon, Lydia submitted our rebuttal. Ava's notes, her deposition, metadata comparisons, Patrick's prior drives, office security logs showing he hadn't entered the building the weekend the documents were supposedly signed. The package was heavy. It carried weight. But more than that, it carried intent. We weren't seeking revenge. We were reclaiming a truth buried under convenience and control. That evening, I sat on the back porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind in the trees. For the first time, I let myself feel something new. Not sadness, not rage, but a grounded knowing. Rebecca had rewritten Patrick's final chapter, but the red ink had bled through, and I was still holding the original manuscript. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope, slid under my door. Not from Rebecca directly, of course, but from the estate board, co-signed by one of Patrick's oldest partners. An official meeting to finalize the transfer of executive authority. No mention of the lawsuit, no mention of my contestation, just the quiet certainty of finality. Thursday at 2 p.m. I read it once, twice, then set it beside my breakfast plate, like it was nothing more than a flyer. But I knew. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a performance. Rebecca wanted me to watch her settle into the chair I once sat beside, to smile like she had earned it. I called Lydia, told her I would attend. Daniel hesitated when I told him, but I reassured him, I'm not going to make a scene. I just need to see it. See the distance between who I was and who I was becoming. That Thursday, I arrived 5 minutes early. The new foundation office was a glass box downtown, all marble floors and quiet elevators. A receptionist led me to the conference room. I recognized faces, men who had worked with Patrick, women who once hugged me at banquets, called me sweetheart while handing me plates of catered chicken. They all smiled politely, but none asked where I'd been. At the head of the table sat Rebecca. Dark blue suit, hair pulled into a perfect knot, a simple watch, a white blouse, power dressed in quiet tones. When she saw me, her smile flickered. surprise, then composure. I nodded and took the empty seat at the far end. The meeting began with pleasantries, donations, upcoming initiatives, strategic language with no soul. Then they reached the agenda item: transition of executive oversight. She cleared her throat and began thanking everyone for their support. She spoke of Patrick's vision, of continuity, of responsibility. It was well rehearsed. Then she said, "I want to thank you for standing by Patrick in the early years, for helping build this foundation. And then, and now, with your grace, I carry it forward." Your grace. Like I had bowed. Like I had handed it over. I sat completely still. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it to Patrick's oldest friend on the board. He looked confused but took it. Inside was Ava's signed statement, a summary from Lydia's legal brief, and a red-marked copy of the page Rebecca had altered in the trust. He didn't say a word. He passed it to the next person, and the next. Rebecca's smile tightened. Her hands stopped moving. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I just let the paper travel. When it reached the end of the table, I stood. "Thank you for the invitation," I said. "My attorney will be in touch if anyone here requires clarification." Then I walked out. Not rushed, not angry, just clear. I drove home with the windows cracked, letting the city noise in. That evening, Lydia called. One of the board members had already reached out, concerned. They wanted an internal review before proceeding with any final transfer of authority. Daniel said it best. That wasn't a confrontation. It was a redirection. Rebecca had expected me to fade. She never expected me to show up with the truth. In the days that followed, the board postponed their vote. Rebecca's lawyer went silent. A request came for a neutral third party to evaluate the contested amendments. Even if nothing came of it legally, the stain was there now. The doubt. The hesitation. And in that space, I found something I hadn't felt in months. Equilibrium. That Saturday, I took Patrick's old file box down from the study shelf. Inside were the Foundation's original charters, handwritten notes about mentorship programs, the first grant proposal he ever wrote. I ran my fingers across the edges of the pages, letting the quiet of the room fill with something that wasn't grief or anger, but resolve. Rebecca had tried to rewrite the end of Patrick's story, but I was still here, and I was not done speaking. I read through each page slowly. Then I packed them up and called Daniel. I wanted them archived properly, not buried in legal boxes, not stamped with court numbers, just preserved. The story of what we built before it was tampered with. I ended that week with a walk along the lake near our old house. The air was cold, but clean, the kind that wakes you up, sharpens your hearing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to defend myself. The truth had its own voice now. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It just existed. Undeniable, unmoved. The days after the board meeting were strangely still. No calls, no threats, no letters with lawyered language or veiled demands. It was as if a curtain had fallen on the stage Rebecca had carefully crafted, and now the audience had quietly left their seats. But I didn't mistake silence for resolution. Lydia warned me. These moments were often the most strategic. When things go quiet, it means people are regrouping. But this time, I wasn't the one who needed to prepare. I had already done my part. I had told the truth. Now it was her turn to reckon with it. I spent that week back in my own rhythm. Small things, watering the plants, reading the paper at the kitchen table, making soup the way Patrick liked it. I no longer felt the rush to chase explanations. Some parts of betrayal remain unexplained, and I had made peace with that. Then came Sunday. Lydia called just after noon. She had received an unexpected email from Rebecca's legal team. There would be no further challenge to the trust inquiry. Rebecca was withdrawing from her position as managing executive of the foundation. No admission of wrongdoing, only a statement about preserving the foundation's reputation and respecting Patrick's legacy. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I simply walked outside with my coat and let the winter air hit my face. Cold, honest, clarifying. The following Tuesday, the foundation released a short press statement confirming the transition. They named a temporary oversight committee of older board members who had worked with Patrick in the early years. Daniel forwarded me a copy, along with a note from one of them. You were right to protect what mattered. I stared at those words longer than I expected. They didn't repair the pain, but they acknowledged something deeper than apology. That week, Lydia and I met one last time in person. She had prepared a summary of the case and the paths I could take if I wanted to formally seek damages or restitution. She laid out every option, measured and neat. I thanked her, but I told her no. I wasn't interested in dragging it further. Not because I had forgiven Rebecca, but because I had already won the part that mattered most. I had taken back my name from a document that tried to erase it. I had reinserted myself into a history I helped build. And more than anything, I refused to become small in the eyes of my own story. That night, I sat in my study and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were handwritten notes from Patrick, old letters, travel receipts, and his list of books he never got around to reading. There was also a sealed envelope I didn't recognize, tucked behind an old ledger. I opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of an earlier will, dated a year before the revision Rebecca had filed. In it, Patrick had detailed his wishes for the foundation, the trust, and my role as lifelong co-trustee. Pages of notes written in the margins, personal phrases, mentions of trips we'd taken, conversations about legacy and balance. My eyes welled as I read the final paragraph. He had written that no matter what happened, he wanted the values we built together to remain at the core of everything the foundation touched. That family wasn't about last names or blood ties. It was about standing beside each other in silence when no one was watching. He had signed it in pen, no witness, just intention. I sat with that paper until the room grew dark. The next morning, I took the document to Daniel and asked him to archive it. Not for evidence, not for court, just for history. A few weeks later, I returned to the foundation for the first time since the fallout. The building was quieter, less polished, less intimidating. The new committee greeted me warmly. They asked for guidance on one of Patrick's early scholarship programs. I offered to review the files and help where I could. They didn't ask me to return in any official role, and I didn't expect them to. That wasn't the point anymore. I wasn't there to be appointed. I was there to witness, to ensure what we built together wouldn't vanish under someone else's edits. I left after an hour, walking slowly to the parking lot. The winter sign was low, casting long shadows across the pavement. I stood by my car and looked back at the glass building. It shimmered, but it no longer intimidated me. It was just a place, a vessel, and I no longer needed its approval. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat by the window with a cup of tea. I thought of Patrick, of Ava and her quiet bravery, of Lydia and Daniel, who had shown up not just as professionals, but as people who believed in integrity. And I thought of myself, not the woman who sat silent during that first reading of the will, but the woman who had returned, fully, not to fight, but to be seen, to reclaim her place, to write the end of the story with her own hand. It had been a month since Rebecca's formal withdrawal, and the world softened in ways I hadn't expected. Without court dates or lawyers on hold, without the weight of signatures waiting for review, I began to move differently. Mornings started slower. I no longer reached for my planner before I finished my tea. I would sit in the sunroom with Patrick's old blanket across my legs, letting the winter light spill across the hardwood floors, and let the stillness be enough. That stillness, I realized, was not the absence of chaos. It was the reward for having faced it. Lydia came by one afternoon with a final packet. Formalities now, mostly. She had closed the inquiries, recorded statements, ensured my role in the original trust was acknowledged in the public record. It was done. There was nothing more to challenge. We didn't talk much. She smiled softly, handed me the envelope, and we sat for a few minutes in quiet before she stood and squeezed my hand. After she left, I placed the folder in the top drawer of Patrick's desk, not locked away, just placed, where it belonged, beside his notes, beside his quiet convictions. That weekend, I visited the garden behind the community center we helped fund years ago. It was winter, but the groundskeeper had planted early bulbs, daffodils, irises, crocuses waiting beneath the surface. Even under frost, life prepares to bloom. I walked the edge of the pathway, remembering the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the way Patrick held my hand as they unveiled the plaque. It was weathered now, but steady. In honor of those who plant for a future they may never see. There were times in these past months when I feared that future had been erased, but it hadn't. It had only been buried under pride and ambition, and now it was uncovered again. Later that week, I received a letter from one of the young scholars who had been part of our first education initiative. She had heard about the changes at the foundation. She wanted me to know how much the grant she'd received years ago had changed her life. She was now working at a local nonprofit, mentoring young girls from neighborhoods like the one she grew up in. Her note was brief, but powerful. She didn't know the full story. She didn't need to. What mattered was that something we started had reached her, and now she was passing it forward. That night, I sat in my kitchen and looked around. It was the same space where I had once felt shut out, unseen, voiceless. But now the silence was different. Now it was full. It held memory, clarity, and peace. I had not burned anything down. I had simply refused to disappear. Spring came slowly that year. The daffodils in the community garden bloomed first, followed by the soft blush of early tulips lining the sidewalk outside the foundation office. I didn't go often, just enough to feel connected, just enough to remember. One morning, I received a small invitation in the mail. Cream envelope, raised lettering. It was for the annual donors luncheon, something Patrick and I had helped establish 2 decades ago, but hadn't attended in years. It felt strange seeing my name listed among the honored guests again. I wasn't sure I would go, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer felt the need to prove anything. But I went. I chose a soft gray suit and pinned Patrick's old lapel pin to my collar, the small silver oak tree he used to wear when speaking publicly. Steady, rooted, quiet. The ballroom hadn't changed. Polished floors, round tables, soft music in the background, people mingling with polite updates. Rebecca wasn't there. Her name had faded from the printed programs, replaced by the interim committee and a new vision statement. I didn't speak much. I just watched. Near the end of the event, something unexpected happened. One of the newer board members, a woman named Lee, took the stage. She was young but spoke with calm and grace. She thanked those who had guided the foundation through its transition. Then she paused. She looked in my direction and said my name, not with ceremony, but with warmth. She spoke briefly about the early days, about Patrick's original mission, about the quiet strength of those who held that mission through storms. Then she stepped down, and the room turned toward me in a wave of gentle applause. I stood briefly and nodded, not for recognition, not for attention, but as a final gesture, a small acknowledgement that the long road I had walked was no longer hidden. It had a name now, and that was enough. That night, I walked home alone. I passed the old bookstore where Patrick used to stop every Sunday. I smiled when I saw they had placed a copy of his favorite novel in the window. Back in my kitchen, I brewed tea and opened the back door. The air was cool, soft. I stepped outside and looked at the sky. It was wide, open, and completely mine. I was not a woman erased. I was not a placeholder in someone else's version of legacy. I was whole, and I was finally home in my own story. If this story reminds you of a time you had to reclaim your voice, your worth, or your place in a family legacy, I want you to know you are not alone. Stories like this carry pieces of all of us, and sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful. Thank you for walking this journey with me.